diligent in what we're doing. So, do I need to turn it on? Gotcha. So anyway, but I hope everybody's doing well, and glad to be back in the church building this morning. This morning, guys, our Sunday school lesson is again, we're following along with a fresh look at the 10 Commandments, and with the title being After God's Own Heart. We know that last week we talked about honoring life and thou shalt not kill. This week we're going to be talking about another firecracker, if you will. We're going to be talking about honoring marriage, and we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, and then we're going to skip ahead as we've been doing and look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. You know, when we think of this idea of marriage and the importance of marriage and honoring a marriage, there's one thing that just came to my mind all week. You know, half of all marriages end in divorce. I mean, it's a fact. And we can sit here and shake our head, but the other thing is that half of all Christian marriages end in divorce. It's the exact same. There's no difference whether in the secular world or in the Christian world. Half of all marriages end in divorce. And as we start this lesson this morning, as we think about this idea of honoring marriage, I think it's so important that we realize that. I don't know if anyone has ever seen the movie War Room. Has anybody seen that? The same brothers that put out Facing the Giants and Fireproof, and it's just a wonderful movie. We watched it a week or so ago for probably the 10th time. A great movie. But in that movie, if you remember, if you haven't seen it, I encourage everybody to go and rent it and watch that movie. Or I don't guess you can't rent movies no more. There ain't a Blockbuster. Go to Walmart. It's usually like in the $7 or $8 aisle and buy it. It'd be money well spent. A wonderful movie. But in that movie, the main characters are dealing with this idea of marriage and the struggle of marriage and trying to make everything happen. But there's just a point in that movie where the elderly lady tells the younger lady, she says, you know, Satan wants to destroy your marriage, and you got to realize who your enemy is. And the enemy isn't your husband, or vice versa. The enemy isn't your wife, but the enemy is Satan, who wants to destroy it. And guys, I believe that with all my heart. As being married for 22 years, I know there's a lot of you in here that's got us beat, and I feel like we've got a lot of folks in here beat. Either way, marriage is hard. Marriage is hard. Yes, sometimes, you're right. But when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, to live my life with somebody else with two different ideas and values and beliefs and way to do things, and to think that we're going to do it day after day after day after day after day after day. And it's hard. And if y'all disagree with me, somebody speak out. I don't think that it's just me that's coming up with this idea. April said sometimes marriage is wonderful. It's great. In my mind, it's one of the most, if not the most remarkable union there is in this world. But yet it's hard. And I say that, and I bring this point up, and I bring the point up about Satan wanting to destroy it, because he does. He knows when a marriage fails that he's won. There's no doubt that children that come from a husband and wife family end up, I'm not going to say they do better, because children are resilient, but their lives during that period are more consistent or better. I'm not going to stand here in the least, and I'm not putting down anybody individual circumstances, but I think we all can realize that There's been study after study, especially in our poor areas, that see the problem that where single parents, mostly mothers, raising children, and in those areas, there's where we have a lot of the problems that our society faces today. I don't have the numbers or figures, but I think it's common sense. Guys, marriage is worth fighting for, and marriage is worth knowing who we're fighting against. And that's the point I really, really, really hope that we get out of this little talk. But we get into our verses this morning. And the very first verse that we're looking at is Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And I'm going to stop right there, and obviously that's the end of the verse. We obviously know what this is saying here. We know exactly what God says in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. Jesus expounds on this verse, right? Jesus said that it's not just enough not to commit adultery, but that we are not to lust. And we're not to have lustful thoughts. And when you tie verse 14 together with what Jesus says, we get into an idea of something that is a pitfall for a lot of those 50% of marriages that don't work. And I'm going to expound on that just for a minute. I know we've got young folks here, we've got older folks here, we've got middle-aged folks here, but this point relates to every one of us. I have an opinion. My opinion is that when you talk about this idea of lusting, when we talk about this idea of Jesus says it's not enough just not to commit adultery, but that we're not to lust, when we let our minds wander, when we let our minds look at something, read something, see something, the problem with that is that we immediately begin to compare our spouse to that. And once we begin to compare our spouse to that, we're comparing our spouse to something that's unattainable and that doesn't exist. It's the same thing with a girlfriend. It's the same thing with a boyfriend. When we start comparing our loved ones to something that we read, see, we're holding them to something that's make-believe and unattainable, but it can only bring us farther and farther apart. Felicia and I we don't like the idea of dating for our children. And one of the main reasons is that, and I'm not saying that we're right, I'm just saying our opinion. Everybody has their own right. But one of our main reasons is that if you date with just this idea of just going to date, then when you find somebody that you really love, you immediately go back and start comparing them at some point in time when there's a struggle, when the rocks come, when the valleys come, you begin to compare that person that you're really serious about to somebody that you were. Does that make sense? It makes sense to us. And those valleys that we get in a marriage or in a relationship, those valleys that we get in, that's when Satan starts telling you, it just ain't worth it. I need to walk away. And then we start, while we're in that valley, we start comparing our loved one to somebody something we've seen or something we've read about or someone that we were with 10 years ago. And it's just another way for Satan to drive a wedge. And so, as we start with this one little verse, thou shalt not commit adultery, I want to expand it and hoping that we see why that is so very, very important. My prayer for Felicia and I and for every one of y'all is that, we're able to honor our marriage. But what everybody in this room has to realize is that there's a force fighting against our marriage as hard as that we are fighting for it. Because if Satan can break a marriage up, he's won a mighty victory. And so there's a whole lot in this one little verse there that we're going to start with. And I'm really love to hear any discussion or anything that anybody else has. I know I'm not right all the time, and I'm not saying I'm right now, but I'm giving you a lot of my opinion. So I'd love to hear what anybody else has to say.
I think it all hinges on what it says there. Adultery breaks trust. That is a pitfall.
Exactly right, April. I think that's a great point. I'll be honest, I didn't do a lot of reading in my material. I kind of did a lot of thinking on all these verses all week. Anybody else want to add anything? You need something, Lonnie.
What I was going to say, honestly, was that, you started out by saying that married, 50% of them end. And that includes 50% of those folks in church. So to me, it talks about how secular the church has become if we allow the same things to break marriage up and to cause breakups in marriage within the church. The same things are happening that the church has become very much like the world in many places, in many situations. And that's a dangerous thing.
Lonnie, I think you're right, but can I add something to that? I think as a Christian and as a married couple, as a Christian, the devil's going to fight us 100 times harder than he's fighting those that are in the world. Understand what I'm saying? He don't care. He don't care if a married couple breaks up that aren't Christians. He could care less. He don't even waste his time bothering with them folks. But those of us that are sitting right here today that are married, he does care about that, and he's going to fight us every step of the way. And so, Lonnie, I think your point is very valid. I think it is that the secularism has come into our church on that point to some degree. But I also think that we are fighting a battle that those that aren't in the church aren't fighting. That's my personal opinion. But I believe there's truth in that. Anybody else before we go on? That's a great point, Janet. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
The other thing is that there are, in probably in both cases, but I think particularly in Christian cases, there are some no-fault circumstances.
No, certainly they are.
I think we need to recognize.
No, and you're 100% right, Lonnie. I don't know that I agree with no fault as on the spouse that was wronged. But there is a fault on the one that did the wronging. I mean, I think you're 100% right. But I think you can boil those down to the battle that's being waged. I mean, I really think that to the spouse that does do the wrong, that all happened because of allowing Satan to get in and to win, and those doubts to creep in, and those ideas and thoughts and everything else to creep in. You know, I've said this in Sunday school before, a long time ago, and I don't even remember I do too. That's the story. We had a devotion book that we did with the kids in this one that we used a long time ago, but it had different, just little stories, little devotion stories. And when I say it's probably, Franklin was probably 6, 7, 8 years old. So we're looking at 12 or 13 years ago when we did it. But it had a little story that was just such a neat story. And I think it can pertain to all areas of life, but especially this. And the little story was about a boy that found a baby snake. And his daddy told him to kill the snake. And the little boy disobeyed his dad and put it in a box in the barn and raised that snake up without nobody knowing about it. And turned out it was a rattlesnake. And the little boy kept that snake in his box, and he fed it every day, and he didn't let his mom and daddy know about it. And one day he went out there to feed it, and the snake bit him. And, he got very sick and almost died. And guys, the moral of that little story is that that's what sin is, right? We have a little teeny sin, a little teeny temptation that we fall towards, but that instead of putting it away, instead of killing it, we put it in a little box and we hide it, and we keep nurturing that, and eventually that sin becomes something big and bad and ugly and harmful. And the moral of that little story is that when that little boy went to feed that sin, it bit him and caused him a lot of pain and agony. Guys, that's whether it be this, whether it be adultery, whether it be thou shalt not kill, as we talked about last week, and this idea of what Christ raised that to that not only should we not kill, but we should not have hate in our hearts. Whatever it is, if we do not get rid of it, if we don't push it completely out of our lives, if we keep it in this little box and continually every now and again to go and nourish it and visit it, it can be just like that snake. And that is the challenge that we face as Christians, because that little snake, that little bitty sin is the way that Satan gets into our hearts, and the way that he gets into our thoughts and he gets into our mind. And it can be just a little thing, and it can be everybody else is doing it, and it's acceptable in society. We can make all kinds of excuses for that little bitty thing, and then by doing that, we make excuses to continually nurture it. But yet we know it's wrong, because what do? We keep it in this little box hidden, but yet we continually visit it. And guys, the moral of that little story, there's another point there, is the dad told the son the day he found the snake to do what to it? To kill it, to get rid of it. So not only did the little boy continue to harbor it, but disobedience caused it to start with. If the little boy would have obeyed his father, then the pain and suffering that he encountered later on would have never happened. Guys, if we obey what God says in these commandments that He has laid out for us, if we obey those, it isn't that God is punishing us. It isn't that God is trying to take something from us. It's that God has a better way. And He wants to protect us, and He wants the absolute best for us. And by our obedience to Him, we're not having something removed from us. We're having something poured upon us in the best that He has to offer. And I think there's just such a great point in that, and especially when it comes to this idea of marriage. If we keep on this point, God says that thou shalt not commit adultery. Christ says we shouldn't lust. We can get into all the issues that entails, and I'm not going to. But truly, being in a marriage and making the marriage work, as April said, is a wonderful thing. And in order to do that, we have to be obedient to what God has called us to do. Is there any more discussion before we go on?
Just like the snake, it seems harmless, small flirtation, soon becomes not harmless anymore.
Exactly right, April. I mean, that we can pull off point after point after point on those same lines.
I think we as Christians, one of the things that really, like, makes a difference, or that I feel like where we fall short. Not that it's meant to put pressure on us or anything. It's meant to be a gift, but I feel like most Christians just view our marriage just like marriage for all the rest of the world. And that's not what I read in the Bible. I mean, according to what the Bible says, Christian marriage, marriage as it's defined in the Bible, is a union of three. It's not a union of two. And it's meant to glorify God. It's meant to be a picture of God and the church. And like I said, I don't feel like that's supposed to put pressure on us. I feel like that's supposed to bring us comfort and show us that, you know, we have to have that third person. We have to have God in there. It's one of the reasons that I don't really, not that I don't care, but I don't really get bent out of shape about what the world wants to say about marriage, because I don't consider the marriage I have to be what they have. So whatever they want to say marriage is, it's like saying what color shoes you're wearing. It's not what I have.
I think that's a great point, Felicia. I think that's a great point. Anybody else, guys? I love this being back in where we can talk again. What a blessing. I'm just thrilled.
It's hard to shout across the.
Well, it's hard to shout, and just that the separation. Separation sucks. I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, it just does. And I'm thankful. Anybody else? All right, guys. I have very mixed feelings about our Sunday school material sometimes, and y'all know that. I love what they have done with this study of the Ten Commandments, and going from the one commandment and then finding, especially exploring the life of David and expounding on that. And so that's what we're going to do today for the rest of our lesson. And I think it's just really good and really neat. But we're going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. And verse 1 says, "And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an evening time that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman." Guys, this is the same King David that we read about last week, right? Last week we held David up. We held David up as the man that didn't take Saul's life when he had every ability and in our eyes, every justification to do it. He had been ordained the king. He had been pursued by this man, although he had never done any wrong to him. And now he had him in his hand, and all he had to do was give the word, and Saul was dead. And David says, "No, I can't do it. You know, God has ordained this man. He has ordained this life, and it's not my means to take it." And we held David up last week, right? Now this week we're going to find a completely different story here. Verse 1 says, "And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem." We all know this story. I don't need to do a backdrop, right? We know what's going to happen. We know what this story is about. We're talking about this idea of adultery. We've been talking about this idea. We've brought in this idea of sin. We've given an example of a little snake. The point that you need to underline in verse 1 is that, "But David tarried still at Jerusalem." Underline that, whether you do it for real or in your mind or whatever. David was the king that led from where? Where had he led all the battles from that we have encountered? The battlefield. He led from the front. He's the king. He's the shepherd boy that said, why are you allowing this Philistine to to berate you when Goliath come out. And he's the king that said, my faith in God is going to kill this giant. And he went out and defeated him. That's how David had always served the Lord and served his job until now. Verse 1 says there at the end, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. He sent his troops out to fight his battles. Guys, when we think about this idea of sin, when we think about this idea of temptation, when we think about this idea particularly that we're looking at this morning of adultery and lust, make sure we're doing what we're supposed to do. Make sure we are at where we're supposed to be at. Make sure we are handling the responsibilities that we're supposed to be handling. You know, the old saying that idle hands are the devil's workhouse, there's a lot of truth to that saying. There's a lot of truth to that saying. You know, I'm not going to give examples because I'm not pointing fingers, because I'll be pointing them at myself. Other than saying, make sure we're taking responsibility for what we're supposed to be taking responsibility for. Me as a father, I need to be, my responsibility as a father and as a husband, as far as my worldly responsibility, I don't think I have anything that is more my responsibility than that is. I don't know that I have a job description. I don't know that me personally, I have any other duties in my life that are more important than me being a husband and a father. Therefore, I need to make sure that I am pursuing the responsibilities of doing that. You know, there's a word that Felicia and I have heard. It's called me time. We've talked to young couples that said they needed me time. I don't understand what me time is, personally. As a husband and as a daddy, my me time ended when I said I do, and at Watauga Hospital on December the 14th, 1999. That was the end. Those were the two end dates of my me time. Make sure we're where we're supposed to be. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. If he would have been on the battlefield with his troops, would the remainder of these verses ever happened? No. If he would have been where he was supposed to have been. The reason that, I don't know that what I'm getting ready to say is exactly right, but I'm going to say it anyway. The reason David was anointed as that shepherd boy, the reason that Samuel anointed him king, was that God saw in David's heart and what he was, and that David was the shepherd boy that went out and fought the lions and fought the wolves and the bears. And that David was the shepherd boy that went out and stood before Goliath. And David was the shepherd boy that valued Saul's life. And those were the things that David following through with his responsibilities. But then in this verse 1, it says, but David tarried still in Jerusalem, or at Jerusalem. Make sure we are where we're supposed to be and doing what we are supposed to be doing. Verse 2 says, and it came to pass in an evening time that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. I'm going to stop there. David, because he wasn't where he was supposed to be, because he had these idle hands, because he wanted some me time, he had done enough already. He had beat Goliath. He had spared Saul's life. He had fought the battles. He had conquered the 10,000s. He had done his part. So now he was tarrying in ease in Jerusalem while the soldiers were out fighting his battle, while Joab was out fighting. And in his me time, he looks off the top of his house and he sees something that he likes. And that he not only likes, we're going to find out in verse 3, it says, and David sent and inquired after the woman. Not only did he like it, he wanted it. And he wanted to be with her. David had an opportunity there in verse 2. David was on his roof and saw something that he liked, and he could have did what? Exactly. He could have just turned around, right? He could have gone back inside. But yet, just like that little snake that his daddy told him to kill, he didn't kill that snake. Instead, he put it in a little box and hid it in the barn, right? That was the first step. He didn't turn around. He continued to see and look. And then in verse 3 it says, and David sent and inquired after the woman. The next step was he continued to nourish that snake by making inquiry. He could have just looked until she went inside and then, went back into his house. But he didn't. He carried it another step, right? April made a great point. These little things, flirtations, these little things that we think don't mean anything, but yet that little thing then can open the door for something else. And we see in verse 3 that's exactly what has happened. Is there any discussion on verses 1 through 3? The latter part of verse 3 now in 2 Samuel chapter 11 verses 3b through 5. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. David didn't turn around. David inquired of this lady. The rest of verse 3 says, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Look right there. David's own man said, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, but then he throwed out the kicker, right? He said, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So this man lets David know that this is a married woman. David had every opportunity. He could have right here at the end of verse 3 said, oh, well, she's married, right? That's end of the story. But yet, he continued to pursue. He continued to pursue. And it all starts from him not being where he is supposed to be to start with. I'm going to say this like 10 more times. It all began, the temptation all started, the means for temptation started because he wasn't where he was supposed to be to start with. He wasn't doing what he was supposed to do to start with. And we find ourselves in verse 3b. Now he's found out that this man is married, this lady is married, and that it's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. There's a lot of things said about that point. Both sides of the story are at fault. But going into the terms and things that's happening in our world, well, I guess if anything happened before COVID, here's Bathsheba, and there's no non-guilty party in this. But David was the king, right? David was the king. And he wasn't just the worldly king. He was the godly king for what everybody knew. Felicia made this point that our marriages as Christians, and Janet made it too, our marriages as Christians are supposed to be different. As Janet said, they're a lighthouse, I think is what you said, Janet. As Christian said, as Felicia said, our marriage isn't just between two of us, but it's a vow between three. David was a godly king. David was anointed by God. David fought Goliath. David spared Saul's life. David jumped up in the streets and sang for joy when the ark was brought into his midst. David was a godly king. Bathsheba would have realized that, right? Not only did David wreck his life, but he wrecked another life too. Would we all agree with that? There's no other way to read it. Yes. Everybody adds that. You're exactly right. It's the same. It's no different than in our world today. It's no different when we talk about this idea of marriage today. It's no different than when I bring up the point when we're not where we're supposed to be doing what we're supposed to be doing. We don't just affect our lives. There's other lives that are affected. Every one of us in here, every single one of us in here has seen lives that were affected because of problems in a marriage or a marriage that failed. Every one of there's nobody all the way down from the youngest kid here has not seen the effects that a marriage failing has. Guys, it's no different with David. You can read verse 4. You can read verse 5. I'm not going to reread those. We know what happened. We know what happens in the verses that follow. So, David, because he wasn't where he was supposed to be, when he was supposed to be there, because he didn't turn around when he had the option and when he had the chance, because he continued to pursue, we have a young lady that is now pregnant, that is married. What comes from that? Murder, right? Outright murder. From an honorable man that when he was called in from battle, because David wanted to cover his tracks, Uriah was called in from battle. David said, I want to update. How's everything going? Uriah says, oh, it's going good. David says, that's great. He says, now go home and be with your wife. Uriah says, I ain't going to go and sleep in my bed with my wife when the rest of the soldiers are laying out there in the dirt. So Uriah sleeps on the foot of the castle. Or not the castle, but David's home. I don't know what else. David calls him in again. He hears that he slept out there on the rocks instead of going home and getting in his bed. David calls him in and says, we're going to have a party. And he feeds him and gets him drunk. And even as a drunk man, Uriah understands that he's not going to go home while the rest of the soldiers are out in the battlefield, and he sleeps on the rocks again. David has no alternative in order to cover his tracks but to get rid of Uriah. So he sends a message by Uriah's own hand to Joab to put Uriah in the heat of the battle and then call all the other troops back. This man that last week we lifted up and we used as an example of the value of human life. This week, we learn that he sends this valiant soldier, Uriah, into battle and calls everybody back. And not only that, he has him carry the own orders Uriah carries those orders in his hand. Guys, don't think for a minute that we can let our guards down. Don't think for a second we can let our guards down. We have to stay vigilant. We have to stay vigilant until the end, because Satan, all he's waiting for is that teeniest, tiniest of openings. And from that teeniest and tiniest of openings, our world can fall apart around us because of the decisions that we make. David is the best example that I know of. The other thing I want to point out, just as I said, last week we held David up as a champion for the value of human life. This week we read the story of his having a man murdered. Guys, just because we're on the mountaintop today, just because we've waited 45 years, 50 years, 70 years, 80 years, it doesn't mean that tonight, that tomorrow, that little opening can allow itself in. We have to stay vigilant. Was David any less? Did God love David any less after these verses than he did from the verses last week? God still loved him. We know that in the rest of this story that Nathan comes to David and he tells David a story about a poor man that had a little lamb, and how that the rich man wanted to feed his friends and went and took the poor man's lamb and killed the poor man's only lamb so he could feed his rich friends. And David's response was what? Kill him. Bring that man before me and I'll take care of him. David heard this story and said, bring him before me and I'll take care of him. And Nathan said what? You are who? You are that man. Guys, that's a whole morning's lesson. It goes back to Jesus Christ saying, get the splinter, remove the plank out of my eye first so I can then get the splinter out of yours. You know, David heard this story and he just was furious about this rich man taking the poor man's lamb, but yet couldn't see himself playing out in it. You know who pulled those blinders over his eyes so he couldn't see? Satan did. He does it to us. We can sit there and see things that are going around us in the world, in our neighborhood, in our community, and we say, that's terrible, that's terrible, that's terrible, that's terrible. But yet we fail to realize the same things happening in our lives. The same things that I'm doing, that I'm guilty of. And Satan is the one that puts those blinders on. It's just like going back to the little story of the snake. As long as we've got it in a box, and as long as we've got it hid, and as long as nobody knows about it, then it ain't hurting nobody. It's okay. But that little snake grows, and in that box one day, it's going to bite us. And it's just, you know, if you're having to hide something besides a birthday present, it ain't right. Guys, is there any more discussion before we conclude this morning? And Bonnie, I know, I say I know, I don't know really, but I know, I can't imagine it's hard for each individual that has to go through. And like I said, there's not anybody in here that's not touched in some way. Not one person. And it goes back, it wasn't God's plan. And you've made just a wonderful point that I'm sure it does break His heart. And it doesn't break His heart because we fail Him. It breaks His heart because He wants so much more for us. It breaks His heart because He never intended us to go through that pain. He never intended us to go through that suffering. That wasn't His plan. And when you say it breaks His heart, I think it does break His heart. But it isn't because we have failed. It's because He wanted and had. He wants us to have so much more. And it goes back to you've led us into just a wonderful conclusion to that one little verse. Thou shalt not commit adultery. It isn't that God doesn't want us to enjoy life, or it isn't that God is trying to keep something from us. It's that He wants us to have the best. And when we look at all of the commandments, And we look at all of what God said. And Danny, I'm glad you're here. I remember a long time ago in Sunday school talking about all the laws that God had gave to the Israelites. And how today we don't understand them. And what difference does it make what you ate? Or what difference does it make, how you did this or how you did that? But it was because God wanted the best for His people where they were at. It wasn't that He was trying to keep something from them. It was that He wants them to have the best. And it goes back to all this, what we're talking about this morning. Felicia mentioned, all of you mentioned when I said it, of the number of lives that were affected by David's decision. And how I want to close this morning is that after Nathan said, David, you are that man. After he said that, David burst into tears and he asked God for forgiveness and he repented of what he did. And God did forgive him. God didn't love David any less, just as He loves any of us any less for anything that we fall short on. God didn't love David any less. But what happened, as we all know, is that God says, this child that Bathsheba is carrying will what? Will die. Not only that, David, not only that, there'll never be peace in your home forevermore. And we know the story of David from there on, that one of his sons raped one of his daughters, and then another son took revenge and killed that son, and then how that this son raises up and tries to have a coup against David and take over the throne from David, and Joab goes out and kills that son, and there was war, and there was pain, and there was suffering in his life from that point on because of that decision he made. God forgave David. God never stopped loving David, but He said, David, you're going to have to live with the consequences of those actions. And for young people and old, but especially young, sometimes we forget, well, I can do and I can get away with this and I can get away with this and I ain't hurting nobody. But at the end of the day, God will forgive you, and maybe you ain't hurting nobody right then. But God will forgive you, but He will also let you live with the consequences of those actions and have to deal with those consequences daily. And I think as we close this morning, my number one prayer, my prayer for each of us every day is to realize how special marriage is. We realize how much God loves us. He loves us so much, He don't give us these laws and these commands to burden us, but instead He loves us so much that He wants us to have the best. And by following these and being obedient, that is how we can have the best. I want us to realize that it isn't the world, it isn't our spouses that we fight against when there is problems, but it's Satan who wants to tear up what we have. I want us to realize that. And guys, in conclusion and just in prayer, I hope that we don't keep that little box hidden when we were told to destroy it and kill it and put it away from us. And then that we're where we're supposed to be when we're supposed to be there. Any more before we conclude this morning?
Jason, I just want to bring up this one verse that comes to mind, 1 Corinthians 10:13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it.
Amen. What a great point.
Remember, He is there for us when we are tempted.
It's a great point. And I'm going to just throw something out, just again, because I think it's so important. To April's point. Had David been where he was supposed to be, he wouldn't have been tempted no ways. Okay, I'm done.